So today we're going to be talking about functional communication training. Functional communication training is a research-based strategy that helps individuals understand how to use communication and adaptive methods to meet their needs. Functional communication training is a replacement behavior or is a methodology for teaching replacement behaviors that looks to reinforce socially appropriate behaviors that are replacing maladaptive behaviors. Maladaptive behaviors are behaviors that are inappropriate, such as hitting, biting, screaming, tantruming, that serve a function to get something that a child or a client wants, but are inappropriate. What we're looking to do is use differential reinforcement to be able to reinforce adaptive means of communication. Functional communication training was initially implemented in 1985 by Carr and Durand. It was used to teach adaptive behaviors for 4 individuals. Now, there's so many different research articles that support the effectiveness of functional communication training as a pivotal intervention for decreasing adaptive behaviors and increasing adaptive functional behaviors. In my research for this project, I was looking over a couple different articles, but the one that stood out to me was Functional Communication Training, a Strength of Evidence Across Disabilities. And this article was implemented by, the study was conducted by Garreau and Davis in September of 2018, and it was a literature review of over 115 single case study designs that showed a reduction in challenging behaviors for individuals diagnosed with a disability, and it resulted in a decrease of challenging behaviors for 135 participants. Children with developmental disabilities are more likely to engage in maladaptive behaviors to meet their needs, such as aggression, self-injuring, property destruction, than their typical peers. We're looking over some of the research from this specific study, and the prevalence rates of challenging behaviors among children with intellectual disabilities range from 22.5% to 52%, and that's research by Cooper et al. In 2007. We see that children with intellectual disabilities are 3 to 7 times more likely to engage in maladaptive behaviors than typical developing children. And that was a study by Alamokhiv in 2013. There's tons of articles to support that individuals with communicative disorders sometimes struggle and may resort to other behaviors to meet their needs. So, the procedures for functional communication training are as followed. The 3 main stages for first starting out in functional communication training really are identifying the interfering behaviors, completing the functional piece, why the behaviors are happening, completing an FBA, and then coming up with socially appropriate replacement behaviors to help the child or the client navigate their environment in a positive way. I'll get into specifically how to implement the differential reinforcement procedures later, but let's focus on these 3 steps first. First, we're going to identify the interfering behavior. That could be hitting, that could be grunting, that could be falling on the floor, and we really want to identify what behaviors are we looking to replace. The next thing that we're going to do is we are going to create and do a functional behavior assessment. With this piece, we want to really look at ABC data, antecedent, behavior, and consequence. What happens before the grunting, hitting, specifically what the behavior looks like, and then what are we doing after the behavior? Are we removing the child? Are we giving the child something? Are we playing with the child? What are we doing afterwards that either increases the behavior, increases the continuation of the behavior, or does the behavior decrease? Let's look at why. The next thing that we're going to look at is figuring out socially appropriate replacement behaviors. When we're looking at socially appropriate replacement behaviors, depending on the child's learner profile, it could be a tap, it could be the use of a communication device, or it could potentially be vocal speech, or even picture exchange. When we look at creating replacement behaviors, we want to be able to identify the replacement behaviors that meet the needs and the functionality of the behavior, whilst also it being socially appropriate. And let's look to see how we can increase and shape those behaviors in some type of metric, whether it be the frequency or the events and whatnot. Let's figure out what behaviors we can increase based on the learner's ability. So now that we've identified the behaviors, we've identified why the behaviors are happening, and we identify how we plan on replacing these behaviors, now we have to figure out exactly how we are going to reinforce these behaviors. Now, when we look at specifically the functionalities of the behaviors, we are going to look at probably three main topics: access to tangibles, access to attention, or escape and avoidance from demands, or some type of social presence, any type of demands. There may be some sensory causes, but for functional communication training for me as a BCBA, majority of not only the research that I found through Davis, through JABA, and as well as my own private practice, I find that the majority of behaviors are going to be in those three categories. So let's look at those. If it's access to tangibles, we're going to specifically look at what does the child want. Using that ABC data, if the child is in the kitchen, tapping on the counter, or yelling next to the fridge, there could be access to tangibles like food. If a child is banging on a toy box or potentially yelling next to the toy center in the classroom, that behavior may be access to tangibles and wanting those toys. Next thing, if we see the child engaging in provocative behaviors, like hitting you, and then when you start to play, they're done. Or if they start to yell and then you give them attention, they're done. Or if you potentially, if the child does something provocative, like spilling water or throwing food, and you reprimand them, potentially that could be a functionality of attention. So what we're going to look to do is find some socially appropriate replacement behaviors. Finally, we're going to look at escape. Sometimes kids don't want to do something, and they may run away, or they may hit you to get put in timeout, or they may scream and yell to avoid doing some type of work. What we want to look to do is to find some escape-based manding, some escape-based verbal behavior to potentially decrease the inappropriate behaviors and to increase the adaptive behaviors. What you're going to see in the next couple clips are instances of possible negative behaviors and adaptive replacement behaviors. One of the things that we're going to look at a lot when we do functional communication training is we are going to look at differential reinforcement. We are going to look at that ABC data. We're going to look at that. What are the stimulus that the kids are potentially trying to get to? What are the behaviors they're exhibiting, and what are the reinforcing consequences. And we're going to look at that. Differential reinforcement is the combination of reinforcement and extinction. So what we're looking to do is we're only looking to reinforce behaviors that are positive, and negative behaviors we're not looking to use a punishment procedure. We are looking to ignore, and we are looking to not give reinforcement. And that's why it's so important to identify the function of the behavior, because especially if it's attention seeking, we do not want to inadvertently give attention. So we may try to use replacement behaviors like play skills to get attention, doing work to get attention, and also too kind of tinkering with the metrics of like how long do they play, how long do they work, what activities can we do. We're looking to use differential reinforcement to reinforce the adaptive behaviors and decrease the maladaptive behaviors. Okay, so the first procedure we're going to talk about is functional communication training for tangible items. So I have a child here that really wants this ball. So she may inappropriately, maladaptively attempt to grab the ball. So she was hitting, grabbing, probably trying to bite, anything inappropriate to try to get this ball out of my hand. Alternatively, she could just say,
"Hey, can I have that ball?"
Great job. Or if this was an individual with a communicative disorder,
how would I hit?
I want ball.
Sorry.
okay, so she could either use the communication device or use her words, vocal speech, or gesturally demand for the ball. Okay, so the next phase of functional communication training could be adaptive methods of attention-seeking behavior. So if this is a child that I'm potentially on my phone doing other things, she may do inappropriate behavior to get my attention, like pushing, punching, hitting, or something provocative to potentially get my attention. Like knocking things over, spilling things, doing provocative things to potentially get my attention to say no or stop. Versus if they want my attention and I'm on my phone and she wants to play, she could just say,
"Do you want to play?"
"Do you want to play?" Awesome. Or if she's nonverbal and using a communication device,
I want play.
"I want to play." Or if she doesn't have any communication and a communication device, she could potentially use a gesture like tapping on my shoulder to get my attention to play. So the next functional communication training aspect we're going to work on is escape-based communication. So potentially I may be trying to engage in a game. "Hey, do you want to play with the ball? Do you want to play? Do you want to play? Do you want to play? Do you want to play with the ball?" And she runs off or tries to hit me to get me to stop. Versus a more adaptive method of communication would be, "Hey, do you want to play with the ball?"
No, I don't want to play.
Or she could potentially use a communicative device that says,
All done.
or if she didn't have a communication device or verbal speech, she could potentially use some type of gesture where she puts her hands up and says, "I'm all done." The last part of functional communication training we're going to talk about is methods of data collection. Ultimately speaking, because functional communication training is often a component of applied behavior analysis, you can imagine that there's quite a bit of data that may be involved. Like we said, from an introduction standpoint, we want to identify the behaviors, which may talk about specifically how we're going to identify what those behaviors look like. Then, from a functional behavior piece, we're going to potentially use ABC data, we're going to do checklists, we're going to use interviews to identify what the functional aspects of the behavior are. Then, potentially what we're going to do is we're going to do trials to potentially probe what the best method of communication could be. This potentially could be using vocal speech. This could potentially using gestures. This could potentially be using a communication device. And then as also, it could be using picture exchange. One of the things that we want to look at specifically is what the methodology, what data do we have to support that which methodology is best, and then taking data collection on the frequency of the trials, taking data collection on the number of prompts, whether it be full physical prompt, whether it be partial prompt, whether it be a verbal prompt, on how to get this individual to communicate effectively, and then potentially talking about the events, the amount of communication that is going to be that is displayed, talking about the frequency, and then potentially too, the data could suggest who best this individual communicates with, and look for specific trends to see who may need training, who may be over prompting, and just overall, generally speaking, what the effectiveness of the communication is. Ultimately speaking, communication training, functional communication training, is a vital procedure when it comes to decreasing maladaptive behaviors. And so many of us, I think, at times take communication for granted. And I think it's a great opportunity to aid an individual with a developmental disability in adaptive inclusion into general environments. Thanks so much, and I hope you enjoyed my video.